It was supposed to be a simple drive from Dallas to Denver, 12 hours straight. I had done it countless times before, but this time something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the unusually dark sky, the kind that seemed to swallow all light, or the fact that my phone was dead, leaving me without GPS or any form of communication. It was like the universe was setting the stage for something to go wrong, but I ignored it, focusing on the road ahead. I hadn't noticed until it was too late that I had taken the wrong turn. Route 99, a desolate backroad highway that I usually avoided because it was out of the way, with long stretches of nothing but barren land and the occasional truck stop. But when I realized I had veered off my regular path, I had no choice but to stick with it. There was no turning back now. There wasn't even a gas station for miles. And it was getting late. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The night was eerily still, the sky above pitch black, with no stars or moon to break the darkness. My headlights carved a small path in front of me, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed. No other cars, no signs of life, just me and the long, lonely stretch of road. After what felt like hours, my eyes began to feel heavy. I could barely keep them open, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the road only made it worse. I needed to rest, even if just for a few hours. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance. Red Sands Motel. I sighed in relief. A motel meant a bed. A few hours of sleep, and I could get back on the road and fix my course in the morning. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, which was more of a dirt patch than an actual parking lot. The place looked as run down as they come. The sign, barely hanging on, flickered in and out of existence. The building itself was a single-story structure, faded paint peeling from the walls, and the exterior lights were dim, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. There were no other cars, except for one old, rusted pickup truck parked in the far corner, almost hidden in the shadows. I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me, but exhaustion trumped my instincts. I convinced myself that it was just a cheap, forgotten motel in the middle of nowhere. There were plenty of those in the world. I stepped out of my car and headed toward the front office. The air was thick and still, as if even the wind didn't dare move here. Inside, the office was dimly lit, a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Behind the counter sat an older man, probably in his 60s, with thick Coke bottle glasses that magnified his eyes, giving him an unsettling, bug-eyed appearance. He didn't acknowledge my entrance. Instead, he just stared at the counter, motionless. "Room for the night?" I asked, my voice cutting through the stillness. The man's head lifted slowly, his eyes meeting mine through the magnified lenses. His face was expressionless, almost like a mannequin, void of any emotion or warmth. "Room 8, he muttered in a gravelly voice, sliding the key across the counter. He didn't look up again. I grabbed the key, mumbled a thanks, and headed out the door. Something about the interaction made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. I was just tired, I told myself. As I walked down the line of rooms, the number 8 glaring back at me from the old rusted door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused and glanced around the parking lot. It was still as empty as when I had arrived. The only sign of life was the flickering neon light of the motel sign behind me. Shaking my head, I turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to room. The room was what I expected, cheap and dingy. There was a single bed in the middle of the room, a tiny, outdated TV on a dresser, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. The wallpaper was peeling in several places, revealing stained drywall beneath. But what struck me the most was the mirror. It was an old rectangular mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed, but it was tilted at an odd angle, almost as if it had been deliberately hung to reflect everything in the room except the bed. No matter how I tried to adjust it, it wouldn't move. It was bolted into the wall at that peculiar tilt. The uneasiness crept back into my chest, but I shook it off. There was no point in getting worked up over a mirror. I just needed some sleep. I kicked off my shoes, collapsed onto the bed, and pulled the musty blanket over myself. The exhaustion was taking over, and soon the room faded away as I drifted off into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of my slumber. There was no sound, no movement, but a strange sensation of being watched. I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes, and glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 3:12 a.m. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow from the bathroom light that I had left on. That's when I saw it. In the mirror, reflected just barely by the dim light, was the outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room, near the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I blinked, trying to shake off the grogginess, but the figure didn't move. I turned my head quickly to the corner, but there was nothing. Just the empty dark room. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the mirror, waiting for something else to appear, but nothing did. It was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. Long drives could do that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. My eyes kept drifting to the mirror, waiting for another glimpse of the shadowy figure. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation and the eerie vibe of the place were just getting to me. But deep down, I knew there was something else, something I couldn't explain. Hours seemed to crawl by, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep again. I woke to the sound of a soft knock on my door. Groggy and disoriented, I checked the clock, 6:30 a.m. Still dark outside. The knock came again, louder this time. I sat up, confused. Who could be knocking at this hour? I rubbed my eyes and stumbled out of bed, peering through the peephole. All I could see was a blurry shape, like someone standing too close to the door. My heart raced, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. Standing there was a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes, her hair tangled and unkempt. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, like something from another era, and it looked like it hadn't been washed in years. Her eyes were wide and empty, staring at me as if she was looking through me. "They're watching," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes darted to the room behind me, her expression filled with fear. "They've always been watching." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was she? And what did she mean by, "they're watching"? I slammed the door shut, locking it, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly gathered my things, my instincts screaming at me to get the hell out of there. As I shoved my belongings into my bag, I heard it, whispering, faint, barely there, but unmistakable. It was coming from the walls, like voices speaking just beyond the surface, their words too muffled to understand. I pressed my ear to the wall, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, dozens of voices, all whispering in unison, their words growing clearer with each passing second. They were talking about me. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. As I rushed into the parking lot, I saw him, the old man from the front desk, standing outside the office watching me. But he wasn't alone. In the windows of every single room, I could see shadowy figures, all staring at me. Their faces were pale and gaunt, just like the woman's, their eyes empty. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands trembling, and finally managed to start the engine. I sped out of the lot, tires kicking up dust, my heart racing as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old man was still standing there, watching me disappear down the road. For miles I drove in silence, my mind reeling from what had just happened. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror again, I froze. For just a split second, I saw the reflection of something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. It was just a brief glimpse, like a flicker, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side of the road, my heart thudding in my chest. I whipped around, fully expecting to see the figure from the motel sitting behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty back seat, my bag tossed carelessly across it. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? I stared into the darkness outside, the desolate stretch of Route 99 before me, the headlights of my car barely piercing through the thick night. Everything felt wrong, like I had stumbled into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, watching, waiting for something to reappear, but it remained empty. Shaking off the creeping dread, I pressed on the gas and sped down the road. I needed to get as far away from that motel as possible. I didn't care about sleep anymore. I didn't care about the long drive ahead. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. For the next hour I drove in silence, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The strange old man, the woman at my door, the whispers in the walls, the shadowy figures in the windows. None of it made any sense, and yet every instinct in my body told me it had all been real. Too real. Eventually the sun began to rise, the first rays of light breaking through the horizon, casting the barren landscape in a dull orange glow. I had never been so relieved to see daylight. The oppressive darkness that had clung to me all night seemed to lift, and for the first time since I'd left the motel, I felt like I could breathe again. I pulled into the nearest gas station, a small, run-down place on the edge of nowhere, and parked my car. I needed a moment to collect myself, to process everything that had happened. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and made my way inside to grab a coffee. The place was empty, save for the clerk behind the counter, a bored-looking guy in his 20s scrolling through his phone. I grabbed a cup of coffee and approached the counter, trying to shake off the lingering unease. As the clerk rang me up, I couldn't help but ask, "Hey, you ever hear anything strange about that motel down on Route 99? Red Sands?" The clerk's face changed instantly. He looked up from his phone, his expression suddenly serious. "Red Sands? You stayed there?" I nodded, the unease creeping back into my gut. "Yeah, last night. Why?" He shook his head slowly, eyes narrowing. "Man, that place has been abandoned for years. No one goes near it. Not after what happened there." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I was just there. There was an old man at the front desk. I stayed in room 8. There was a woman who came to my door." The clerk looked at me like I had just said something insane. "No, dude, that place is cursed or something. Back in the 80s, some crazy stuff went down there. People who stayed there disappeared. No bodies were ever found, but everyone in town knew something wasn't right. The owners vanished too, but their stuff, like their old truck, it's still there, just rotting away. No one's run the place since." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I saw them. I talked to the old man. The clerk just shook his head. "I don't know what you saw, but no one's alive out there. Not anymore." I stood there frozen as the reality of what he was saying sank in. The figures in the windows, the whispers in the walls, the old man watching me drive away. They weren't just people. They were ghosts, remnants of whatever had happened there all those years ago. And somehow, I had crossed paths with them, had stayed in their motel, had spoken to them. Without another word, I grabbed my coffee, left a few bills on the counter, and walked out of the gas station. As I got back into my car and started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could comprehend. The voices, the figures, the woman, they had all been watching me, waiting. And now, as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at me from the back seat. But this time, there was nothing. Just the empty road behind me, or so I thought. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every time I looked in the mirror, whether it was in my car or in my apartment, I caught glimpses, just faint shadows lurking in the background. They never stayed long enough for me to truly see them, but I knew they were there, watching, waiting, and every night, just as I drifted off to sleep, I heard them, the whispers. I was on the road for work, driving cross-country as I often did. The route was mostly deserted highways, with the occasional small town, gas station, or truck stop. That night, I found myself pushing well past midnight, even though I knew I should have stopped hours ago. My eyes were burning from the long stretch of driving, and my mind was fogging over with fatigue. I wasn't anywhere near my destination, and the only thing I could think about was finding a place to sleep for a few hours. Pulling up my phone, I searched for motels in the area, but nothing came up. Just empty roads and blank spaces on the map. After what felt like forever, I saw the glow of a neon sign flickering in the distance, a red vacancy light. The Crescent Motel was spelled out in half-working letters. It was an old rundown place, the kind you see in horror movies. I hesitated, but there were no other options around. Besides, I figured it was just a few hours of sleep. How bad could it be? I pulled into the gravel lot and parked in front of the main office. The motel had maybe 8 rooms, all of them arranged in a U-shape around the lot. A dim porch light illuminated the door to the office, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, peeling paint, rusty metal railings, and a general air of neglect. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car, shivering as a sudden gust of wind hit me. It wasn't cold, but something about the air felt off, like it was thick with something invisible, something I couldn't quite place. I shook off the feeling and walked up to the office door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The front desk was empty, but there was an old-fashioned bell sitting on the counter. I rang it once, and the sound echoed through the room. A minute passed. No one came out. I rang the bell again, this time harder, feeling impatient. Just as I was about to leave and try my luck sleeping in my car, an old man appeared from the back room. He was tall and gaunt, with thin white hair that stuck up in all directions. His face was dull and wrinkled, like someone who'd been hiding from the sun for years. He had the kind of unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Need a room, do you?" His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, feeling a little uneasy under his gaze. He didn't ask for ID or payment up front, just handed me a tarnished brass key attached to a worn-out leather fob with the number 7 engraved on it. "Room 7. Last one on the left." "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing the key and turning to leave. Before I made it out the door, his voice stopped me. "Don't leave your room after midnight, and don't look out the window." I froze mid-step, turning back to face him. He was staring at me, unblinking, as if waiting for me to ask why. But something in his expression told me not to. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of local superstition, or maybe the guy was just trying to mess with me. Either way, I nodded and hurried out the door. Room 7 was exactly what I expected: cheap, outdated, and musty. The wallpaper was peeling and the carpet was stained in places I didn't want to think about. The bed looked like it might collapse if I sat on it too hard, but I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the chair in the corner and sat down on the edge of the bed. I glanced at the old clock on the nightstand. It was 11:45 p.m. I had 15 minutes before whatever midnight warning the old man gave me would kick in. But what did he mean? Don't leave the room? Don't look out the window? What kind of place was this? I locked the door, then pulled the curtains tightly shut. I didn't want to see anything outside, just in case. The wind outside seemed to pick up, howling against the window like a distant wail. I kicked off my shoes and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling gaze. I closed my eyes. I tried to convince myself that everything was normal, that the old man's warning was just some creepy hotel owner's trick to scare off guests. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Suddenly, the wind outside stopped. It wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I looked at the clock. It was 12:02 a.m. The room felt wrong, like the air had gotten heavier, like the walls were closing in. And then there was a noise, a soft scratching sound like something was brushing against the outside of the door. My throat tightened, and I froze, listening intently. Scratch. It was rhythmic, slow, like someone, or something, was deliberately dragging their nails across the wood of the door. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was the wind again, or a tree branch scraping against the building. But I knew that wasn't true. The sound was too precise, too deliberate. And then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything in the oppressive silence, but nothing came. I told myself to stay put, to not open the door, to not give in to the irrational fear creeping up my spine. But then the knob on the door rattled. My stomach dropped. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I scrambled to my feet, backing up against the far wall, my eyes locked on the door. The knob turned again, this time more forcefully, as if whoever or whatever was outside was getting impatient. I couldn't see a shadow under the door, no sign of feet or a figure, but I knew something was out there. Then came the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind again, but no. It was too clear, too human. Words I couldn't make out, just faint murmurs coming from the other side of the door, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed myself against the wall, willing the sounds to go away. And then, without warning, the doorknob stopped moving. The whispers ceased. I stayed frozen, listening for any sign of movement, any indication that the thing outside was gone. Minutes passed, but I didn't dare move. The silence was unbearable, thick and heavy. Finally, I took a shaky breath and forced myself to approach the door. I wasn't going to open it. I just wanted to check to see if anyone was still there. My hand trembled as I reached for the peephole. I pressed my eye to it, half expecting to see something horrifying staring back at me. But there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot and the dim glow of the flickering vacancy sign in the distance. I exhaled slowly, my muscles relaxing just slightly. But then I saw it. A figure standing near the office, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its head was tilted at an odd angle, as if it were staring directly at me even from that distance. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of its body, and then it moved, slowly, almost lazily, toward my room. I stumbled back from the door, my blood running cold. Whatever that thing was, it was coming for me. The old man's words echoed in my mind. Don't leave your room. Don't look out the window. I had already broken one of those rules. I had looked. The figure was closer now. I could feel it, even though I didn't dare check the peephole again. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't leave. I couldn't stay. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, more insistent. And then I heard it, whispering again, but this time right outside my window. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the phone on the nightstand and dialed. But as I put the phone to my ear, all I heard was static. No dial tone, no operator, just an unsettling hiss on the other end. The whispering outside grew louder, closer. I dropped the phone and backed into the corner of the room, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The window rattled as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The air in the room grew still, the oppressive silence returning. I stayed huddled in the corner, too terrified to move, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed, then an hour, and then another. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the edges of the curtains that I dared to stand. I cautiously approached the window and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtains. The figure was gone. The parking lot was empty. I grabbed my bag and ran out of that room without looking back. As I passed the office, I saw the old man standing behind the desk, watching me with that same unsettling smile. "You made it," he said, his voice dripping with something that sounded almost like disappointment. I didn't respond. I just got in my car and drove. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed any longer. All I know is that I'll never go back to the Crescent Motel. I've traveled a lot for work. Too much, probably. I've stayed in some sketchy motels, but this particular place, still haunts me. I never really believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. It was late, around 1 a.m., when I finally decided to pull off the highway. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see through the windshield. Each flash of lightning illuminated the desolate road, casting fleeting shadows on the cracked asphalt. I was exhausted after driving for hours, and my phone's GPS had given up on finding a place for me to stop. That's when I spotted the dim glow of a neon sign up ahead, the Sunset Lodge, vacancy. The sign flickered like a heartbeat, dimming every few seconds, almost as though it was struggling to stay alive. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the narrow highway into a slick, glistening path. As I pulled off the road and into the gravel lot, the tires of my car skidded slightly in the mud. Gravel crunched under the weight of my car as I parked, and I let out a long sigh of relief. I needed rest, and at that moment, the Sunset Lodge seemed like salvation. The motel wasn't much to look at, more of a dump really, but it was a place to sleep. The two-story building was run down, with chipped paint and sagging roof lines that made it look like it was sinking into the earth. The windows were small, covered with grimy curtains that hadn't seen a wash in years, and the whole place had the unsettling look of somewhere time had forgotten. Each room had a dim light outside its door, but the light bulbs buzzed weakly, threatening to go out at any moment. There were a few other cars in the lot, but the place still felt disturbingly empty. I stepped out of the car and instantly felt the cold rain soak through my jacket. The wind howled, making the narrow walkway leading to the office feel even more isolated. The rain was relentless, pelting my face as I hurried along the wet concrete, my shoes squeaking with every step. The air had that thick, humid quality that made everything feel sticky, and I shuddered as the cold air crept under my soaked clothes. The office was small and uninviting, with a single flickering open sign hanging in the window. I pushed open the door and a bell jingled weakly as I stepped inside. The interior was worse than the outside. A small desk sat against the far wall, cluttered with papers and what looked like several months' worth of dust. The carpet was worn and stained, and the dim lighting gave the room a sickly yellow hue. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and the whole place felt like it had been left to rot for decades. I rang the small bell on the counter, the sound echoing through the empty room. After a few moments, a man emerged from a back room. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of a different era. His hair was greasy, slicked back over his head, and his shirt was wrinkled and stained, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, giving him the appearance of someone who hadn't slept in a long time. He smiled at me, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and distant. "You need a room?" he asked, his voice raspy and low, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, suddenly feeling uneasy. He didn't ask for any details, no ID, no credit card, nothing. He just reached behind him and grabbed a key from the wall. "Room 12 down at the end," he said, handing it to me. His fingers brushed mine, and his skin felt cold, almost clammy. I grabbed the key quickly and muttered a thank you before turning and heading back out into the rain. The interaction left a bad taste in my mouth, but I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to get some sleep and get back on the road in the morning. The wind had picked up even more by the time I reached room 12. It was at the far end of the lot, with a single flickering bulb barely illuminating the door. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to unlock the door. The lock clicked open, and I stepped inside, immediately hit with the smell of dampness and decay. The air was heavy and stale, like the room hadn't been aired out in years. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb in the ceiling barely lit up, casting the room in a dull yellow glow. The bed sat in the middle of the room, covered in a faded, threadbare blanket that looked like it had been there since the motel opened. A small dresser with a cracked mirror stood against one wall, and an ancient-looking TV sat on top of it. The walls were stained with watermarks, and there was a dark, damp patch in one corner of the ceiling. The whole place reeked of neglect. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down on the edge, feeling the springs creak beneath me. The room was cold, and the sound of the rain beating against the window only made it feel more isolated. I tried to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me, telling myself it was just exhaustion. I just needed to sleep, and everything would feel better in the morning. But as I lay down and pulled the musty blanket over me, something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. Even with the rain, the room felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound like whispering, barely audible over the rain. I sat up, straining to listen, but the room was silent. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes in the walls. But as I lay back down, the whispering came again, louder this time. It was coming from the bathroom. I froze, staring at the closed bathroom door. The sound was unmistakable now, low voices murmuring, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. My heart started to pound, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate knocks, coming from the bathroom door. I stared at the bathroom door, my breath caught in my throat. 3 knocks, clear, deliberate, and coming from inside the room. The whispers continued, just under the surface of the knocking, like someone was speaking too low for me to understand. But I could hear the insistent cadence of it. I didn't want to move. Every instinct in me screamed to stay still, stay safe. But another part of me, maybe driven by curiosity or the need to confirm I wasn't imagining things, forced me to stand up. I hesitated by the edge of the bed, my feet rooted to the cold, worn carpet, unable to take that final step toward the door. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like an argument just out of earshot, the words tumbling over one another. I could feel my pulse in my throat now, each beat louder than the last. It was impossible, I thought. There was no way anyone was in that bathroom. I hadn't heard anyone enter, and I had been alone since the moment I walked into the room. Then came the knocks again, 3 times, louder, as if demanding my attention. This time they were followed by a scraping sound, like nails or something sharp being dragged across the inside of the bathroom door. I swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. The room felt colder now, the air thick like a weight pressing down on me. My fingers trembled as I reached for the bathroom door handle. The whispers stopped abruptly, like they knew I was listening, and in that sudden, unnatural silence, I was more terrified than ever. My hand wrapped around the cold metal of the knob, and I twisted it slowly. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The light in the main room didn't reach into the small bathroom, and I couldn't make out any details, just a black void where the tiled wall should be. I reached blindly for the light switch on the wall inside, my fingers brushing against it as I flicked it upward. The light blinked on, flickering weakly before settling into a dim, sickly yellow glow. The bathroom was small, with an old porcelain sink stained from years of disuse and a cracked mirror hanging above it. The shower curtain was drawn closed, its faded floral pattern barely visible in the low light. But nothing appeared out of place, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noises I'd heard. I stood in the doorway, my heart still racing, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. But then, just as I began to step away, I heard a soft thud behind me, coming from the mirror. I whipped around to face the mirror above the sink, and that's when I saw it. For a split second, reflected in the glass, there was the faint outline of a figure standing behind me. It was so quick that I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person before it vanished, leaving nothing but my own pale, terrified reflection staring back at me. I stumbled backward, my body crashing into the doorframe as I scrambled out of the bathroom. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I wanted to leave, to get out of that room as fast as possible, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stood there, frozen, my eyes fixed on the bathroom, as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. Then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered, dimmed, and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I let out a small, involuntary gasp. The only light now came from the weak glow of the bulb outside, which barely filtered through the thin curtains. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with fear as I tried to turn on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness, and I swept it around the room, half expecting to see something standing there, waiting for me. But the room was empty. Everything was as it had been before, except for the oppressive, suffocating feeling that something was watching me. I shined the light toward the bathroom again, my heart pounding, but there was no movement, no sign of anything out of place. I backed up toward the bed, trying to make a plan. I could leave, just grab my things and run, but that meant walking out into the storm and driving in the dead of night, exhausted and terrified. My mind raced, weighing my options, but then, as I lowered my phone to the floor, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, and they weren't coming from the bathroom. They were coming from the walls, surrounding me. It was as if the room itself was alive with voices, muttering in hushed tones, too low for me to understand but loud enough to send chills down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my bag from the bed, I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, and for a moment, it felt like it wouldn't open, like something was holding it closed. I yanked on the knob with all my strength, and finally, the door swung open. I burst out into the rain, the cold wind hitting me like a slap to the face. My car was just a few steps away, but in my panic, those steps felt like miles. I sprinted across the gravel lot, my shoes slipping in the mud as I ran. The whispers followed me, carried on the wind, faint but persistent, like they didn't want me to leave. I fumbled with my car keys, dropping them in the wet gravel. Cursing under my breath, I snatched them up and quickly unlocked the door. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to turn the key. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the motel in front of me, and that's when I saw them. Standing in the windows of several rooms, their faces barely visible through the rain-streaked glass, were figures. Pale, ghostly figures, watching me with hollow, empty eyes. Their mouths moved, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. I didn't want to hear. I slammed the car into reverse and sped out of the lot, the tires kicking up mud as I drove away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the motel long out of sight. Even then, the whispers still lingered in my mind, like they had followed me, clinging to me long after I left. I don't know what I encountered that night. I don't know if the Sunset Lodge was haunted, or if I was just sleep-deprived and imagining things. But every now and then, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I still hear those whispers, soft and low, like they're waiting for me to come back. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never stay in another roadside motel again. I was already regretting my decision to stop at the Sundown Motel the moment I pulled into the parking lot. The place was one of those old, rundown motels you see along forgotten highways, one story, all the rooms lined up in a neat row, each with peeling paint and flickering neon signs that spelled out vacancy. The rain hadn't let up for hours, and I had no choice. My GPS had lost signal somewhere between two nameless towns, and the idea of driving further into the storm was quickly becoming less appealing by the minute. There was a faint light glowing from the small office at the front, so I grabbed my duffel bag and sprinted through the downpour. The bell jingled as I entered, and I was hit with the smell of mildew and something faintly chemical, like old cleaning supplies. The man behind the desk didn't look up right away. He was hunched over a small black and white TV, the static from the screen casting flickering shadows across his face. After a moment, he tore his gaze from the TV and turned his attention to me. His eyes were strangely distant, as if he hadn't seen a guest in a while. "Need a room?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. I nodded, though part of me already wanted to leave. But the storm was only getting worse, and there was no guarantee I'd find anywhere else open tonight. Just for the night. He slid a key across the counter without asking for payment or checking any sort of record. Room 8. I noticed the keychain was an old metal tag, scuffed and worn from years of use. No logo, no design, just the numbers stamped onto it. It felt colder than the rain-soaked air outside. "Room's down the hall, last one on the left," he muttered, turning back to his TV. I grabbed the key and stepped back into the rain, heading for the room. Something about the silence in the lot made me uneasy. I glanced up at the other windows. No lights on, no movement, nothing. As if I was the only one staying here. When I reached room 8, I pushed the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open reluctantly, and I was greeted by a wave of cold, musty air that settled in my throat like dust. The room was small, bed, nightstand, TV, and a bathroom to the right. The carpet was worn, stained in places I didn't want to think too much about. The wallpaper was faded, curling at the edges, the once bright pattern now barely visible. I tossed my duffel on the bed, suddenly more exhausted than I had realized. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, and I flipped on the small lamp by the bed, which buzzed faintly before casting a dim, yellowish light across the room. I grabbed my phone and checked for a signal. Nothing. Not even a single bar, just my luck. I sat on the bed, contemplating whether or not to try the TV. The idea of watching whatever static-filled channels this place offered felt like more effort than it was worth. Instead, I let my head fall back onto the pillow. Just for a moment, I told myself, just to rest. A sound stirred me awake, soft but unmistakable. A faint tapping, like knuckles lightly rapping against wood. For a moment I thought it might be the rain, but no, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I sat up, looking toward the door, but it wasn't coming from there. The sound was closer, almost like it was in the room with me. I listened again, straining to locate the source, but it seemed to echo strangely in the small space, bouncing from one corner to the next. I stood up and walked around the room, feeling ridiculous as I checked the closet, the nightstand, even under the bed. Nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was just the building settling, that old motels like this made strange noises all the time. Then it happened again, louder this time, 3 clear knocks coming from the bathroom. I froze. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see the dark outline of the small windowless room. There was no reason anyone should be in there, yet the sound persisted, 3 sharp raps, like someone knocking from the inside. A knot formed in my stomach. Slowly I approached the door, hand hovering just over the handle. The air felt heavier, colder. I took a breath and pushed the door open fully, expecting, well, I didn't know what I expected. The bathroom was empty, just a cracked sink, an ancient toilet, and a shower with a curtain drawn across it. I stood there for a moment, waiting, listening. The only sound was the water dripping from the tap into the sink, slow and steady. I stared at the shower curtain. The fabric hung limply, a dingy white that had long since lost its color. The idea that something, or someone, could be behind it sent a chill through me. I reached out and yanked it aside in one quick motion. The tub was empty. Nothing but dust and grime. I let out a shaky breath and backed out of the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. I was being paranoid, letting my imagination get the better of me. It was late, I was tired, and this place was messing with my head. I decided to turn on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out my unease. The screen flickered to life with static, and I flipped through the channels, but nothing came in clearly. I left it on one of the fuzzy stations and lay back on the bed, trying to shake the tension that had crept into my chest. That's when the lights flickered. A brief stutter, then darkness. I sat up straight, listening. The rain outside had stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a deafening silence. I fumbled for my phone, using its screen to cast some light around the space. The tapping started again. This time, it wasn't from the bathroom, it was from the walls. A soft, insistent knock, like someone knocking from the other side of the plaster. I listened, every muscle tense. The sound seemed to travel, moving from one wall to the next, surrounding me. Then came the voices, whispers, faint and distant at first, like someone having a conversation in the next room. But I knew there was no one next door. There hadn't been a single car in the lot besides mine. The whispers grew louder, but I couldn't make out any words. Just the cadence, like they were speaking in a language I didn't understand. The tapping became more frantic, as if something or someone was trapped and desperate to get out. I stood, backing away from the walls, my breath quickening. The whispers seemed to close in, wrapping around me, coming from all directions now. I grabbed my bag ready to leave when the TV suddenly flickered back on, the static louder than before. Through the white noise, I could see faint shapes shifting, like shadows moving behind the screen. My stomach lurched as the shadows became more defined, figures, standing there, staring out from behind the glass. They weren't clear, more like outlines, but I could feel their gaze, cold and heavy. Then without warning, the shadows pressed against the screen. It bulged outward, like the glass itself was straining to contain them. The whispers turned into urgent muttering, overlapping voices, building into a frenzy. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. The moment I stepped outside, the air was eerily still. The rain had stopped completely, but the sky was dark, thick clouds blotting out any stars or moonlight. The motel stood silent and foreboding, each window like a dark eye watching me. As I ran toward my car, I glanced back, just once. Every room had a figure standing in the window, their outlines faint against the darkness, but unmistakable. They stood motionless, watching, waiting. I didn't look back again. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and I backed out of the lot as fast as I could, heart racing. I didn't dare check the rearview mirror to see if they were following me. As I drove away, the road stretched out before me, illuminated by the car's headlights, the rain slicking the asphalt and reflecting the glow. I forced myself to breathe steadily, to convince myself it was over, that I had left the motel behind me, along with whatever ghosts resided there. But the whispers didn't fade. They lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting echo that refused to be silenced. After several miles, I pulled over at a gas station. The flickering neon lights felt reassuring against the darkness, a small beacon of normalcy. I got out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and stepped inside, needing to collect myself. The gas station was mostly empty, save for a clerk behind the counter and a few shelves stocked with snacks and drinks. I approached the clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "Hey, do you know anything about the Sundown Motel down the road?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly. "That old place? Yeah, it's been there forever. You staying there?" I nodded. "Just for the night. Is it safe?" The clerk looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing his response. "Safe enough, I guess." But he added, "I wouldn't stay there long if I were you. There's a lot of stories about that place. Weird stuff happens." A chill crept down my spine and I felt my heart rate quicken again. "What kind of stories?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "People claim they hear voices, see things in the rooms. The last few years, guests have gone missing. I don't know if it's true, but let's just say I wouldn't recommend it." The gravity of his words pressed down on me. I could feel my stomach twist in knots, recalling the whispers and the shadows I had just fled from. "What do you mean, missing?" "Just that," he said, shrugging. "People check in, but they never check out. It's not like a horror movie, but you know how these things go. Some folks say it's haunted. I forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. Right, haunted. I glanced at the clock on the wall, feeling time slipping away. Well, thanks for the heads up. I hurriedly bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips, wanting to escape the conversation and the oppressive atmosphere. The clerk watched me as I left, his expression unreadable. Back in my car, I debated whether to go back to the motel. The thought of driving further into the night was daunting, but staying in that room seemed like a terrible idea. I took a long drink from the bottle, trying to shake off the unease. After a moment, I decided I would drive away. I would find a different place, something safer, more welcoming. I backed out of the gas station lot, but before I could pull onto the highway, a flicker of movement caught my eye. It was a figure standing near the edge of the woods that bordered the motel's property. The silhouette was hard to make out, but it seemed to be watching me, unmoving. I squinted, trying to discern who or what it was. I felt a strange compulsion to go back. Maybe it was a hitchhiker or someone who needed help. But deep down, I knew I shouldn't. I had already witnessed enough. But the figure raised its arm and waved, a slow, deliberate motion. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I couldn't see its face, but something about the gesture felt almost inviting, like it was beckoning me back. Just as I was about to make the turn back toward the motel, a loud bang reverberated through the night, an explosion of sound that rattled the windows. I nearly jumped out of my seat, instinctively turning to see where it had come from. The gas station clerk was standing outside, his arms raised as if signaling for me to stop. But I didn't stop. I floored it, leaving the figure and the clerk behind, my heart racing anew as adrenaline surged through me. I drove, not caring where the road led, the darkness swallowing me as I left the gas station in the dust. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen, what I had heard. It felt surreal, as if I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Eventually, the road opened up, and I found myself on a stretch of highway illuminated by my headlights. The tension began to ease just slightly as I focused on the familiar sound of tires on pavement, the reassuring hum of the engine. But my relief was short-lived. Just a few miles down the road, I saw another motel up ahead, the Crest Inn. It was brighter, with lights glowing warmly in the windows, a welcoming sight after the horrors of the last few hours. I pulled into the lot and parked, taking a deep breath before stepping out. The air was different here, clearer, almost refreshing. I walked toward the office, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot grounding me as I approached. The bell chimed as I entered, and the warmth enveloped me. A friendly woman stood behind the counter, her smile genuine. "Welcome. How can I help you?" "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to project confidence despite my frayed nerves. "Of course. We have plenty of vacancies. Would you prefer a single or double?" I didn't care. "Just a single, please." As she began the C-check-in process, I could feel the tension releasing its grip on me. This place felt safe, and I was grateful for the sense of normalcy it provided. "Room 12. Here's your key." She handed me a card, her smile unwavering. "We have coffee available in the morning, and the Wumpy's free." "Thanks," I said, genuinely relieved. I headed to my room, the soft glow of lights in the distance making me feel more at ease. As I reached room 12, I inserted the key and opened the door. The interior was inviting, clean, fresh-smelling, and devoid of the musty scent that lingered in the Sundown Motel. I tossed my bag on the bed and let out a sigh. I could finally relax. As I settled in, I turned on the small TV, letting the familiar sound of a sitcom wash over me. I needed to distract myself from the events of the night. I tried to focus on the show, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the Sundown Motel, to the shadows I had seen, to the whispers that had haunted me. Eventually, fatigue took over, and I crawled under the covers, the warmth cocooning me in comfort. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt safe for the first time that night. But peace is often fleeting. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a sound, a soft tapping, just like before. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was nothing to see. I lay still, listening intently. The tapping continued, but it was muffled, as if it were coming from the other side of the wall. I sat up, straining to hear. Was it coming from the next room? My mind raced with possibilities. I thought about the gas station clerk's words, about the stories of missing guests. Had I made a mistake coming here? The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, willing myself to ignore the fear clawing at my insides. I could just check. Maybe someone was in distress. I tiptoed to the door, placing my ear against it. The noise was clearer now, definitely coming from next door. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 3. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I call the front desk or knock? Then the whispers began. They floated through the wall, soft and unintelligible, wrapping around my mind like a fog. I backed away, fighting the urge to bolt. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the old building settling or maybe someone talking in their sleep. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more frantic. My instincts kicked in. I needed to leave. I moved quickly, throwing on my clothes and grabbing my bag. Just as I reached for the doorknob, a loud thud echoed from the other side of the wall, making me jump back. Without thinking, I flung the door open and stepped into the hallway. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy, as I glanced toward room 11. The door stood slightly ajar, just like mine. I could hear the whispers clearer now, intertwined with a soft, sobbing sound. My heart raced again, but I was drawn to it, compelled to investigate. I approached room 11, my breath shallow and rapid. "Hello?" I called softly, knocking on the door. "Is everything okay in there?" Silence fell over the hallway, and the whispers faded. I felt a chill sweep through me, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But just then, the door creaked open a bit further, revealing a dimly lit room. "Help me," came a weak voice, trembling and desperate. Without thinking, I stepped inside, my instincts overriding the fear. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly, a figure huddled in the corner, shrouded in shadows. It looked like a woman, her hair matted, her clothes tattered. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" She looked up and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, but it was the way she moved that unnerved me. She shifted closer, almost crawling, her gaze darting around as if she were expecting someone. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They want me back." "Woo," he managed, my heart racing again. But before she could answer, a low growl reverberated through the room, vibrating in my chest. I froze, watching as the shadows began to shift and swirl, coalescing into forms that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to run. "You need to get out of here," I urged her, but she didn't seem to hear me. Her eyes were glazed, focused on something behind me. And that's when I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, brushing against my back. I turned to look, and the room seemed to warp around me. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They were hovering, their faces blank, mouths moving in a silent chant, their voices merging into a cacophony of whispers. I stumbled back, colliding with the woman as she shrieked, "No, you can't let them take you." Panic surged through me, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I spun back toward the door. The shadows pressed closer, an oppressive weight closing in around me. I threw myself toward the exit, but the air grew thick as if the darkness itself was trying to hold me back. "Help me," the woman cried again, her voice laced with desperation. "Don't leave me." I hesitated, torn between my instincts to escape and the plea for help. But I couldn't afford to linger. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, swirling around me like a storm. With every ounce of strength, I pushed through the doorway and bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The sound echoed in the silence, but I could still hear the whispers, muffled and distant behind the door. I stumbled back toward my own room, every instinct screaming at me to flee the motel entirely. My heart raced as I fumbled for my key, the cold metal slipping between my fingers. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and burst inside, locking it behind me. The room felt safe, at least for the moment. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily as I struggled to process what had just happened. My mind raced with thoughts of the woman in room 11. What had she meant by, "They want me back"? I paced the room, wrestling with my fears and thoughts. The night felt long and unnerving. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was safe here. Yet, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building sent jolts of fear through me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed. I turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts, but instead of comfort, the flickering images on the screen only added to my sense of unease. Eventually, the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the thin curtains. I felt the tension in my chest start to ease, and I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another night. I quickly gathered my things and headed out the door. The hallway was eerily quiet, and I half expected the whispers to return at any moment. As I reached the main office, I saw the clerk sitting behind the counter, his gaze fixed on something in front of him. "Good morning," he greeted me, though his tone was flat, almost rehearsed. "Hi," I replied, trying to mask my anxiety. "I'd like to check out, please." He nodded and began typing on the computer. "Did you enjoy your stay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, it was fine, thanks." He glanced up, his eyes searching mine. "Just fine? No complaints?" "None at all," I said, feeling a sense of urgency to get out. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he processed my checkout. I could feel the weight of his scrutiny, as if he knew something I didn't. "Here you go," he said finally, handing me my receipt. "Drive safe." "Thanks," I murmured, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as I stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and cool, but it felt cleansing, a fresh start after the nightmare of the night before. I climbed into my car and took a deep breath, ready to put the motel behind me. As I pulled onto the highway, I glanced back at the motel. It loomed in the distance, an imposing structure against the sunrise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, a thread of dread still tugging at my consciousness. I drove for what felt like hours, my thoughts consumed by the events of the night. Had that woman been real, or was she just a figment of my imagination, a reflection of my own fears? But the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced she had been real. The terror in her eyes, the way she had pleaded for help, it all felt too vivid to dismiss. As I navigated the winding roads, the scenery began to change from dense woods to open fields, the sun climbing higher in the sky. I thought about stopping for breakfast, but the memory of the gas station clerk's warnings held me back. I didn't want to linger anywhere that felt unsafe. Eventually, I pulled into a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the early morning light. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air, and I stepped inside, relieved to find a bustling atmosphere filled with the chatter of patrons. I settled into a booth, grateful for the sense of normalcy. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself scanning the faces around me, looking for any sign of familiarity. Perhaps the woman from the motel would appear here too. But as time passed, I began to relax. The waitress was friendly, and the food was good. It felt like a slice of reality, a reminder that life went on beyond the shadows of that motel. After finishing my meal, I paid and headed back outside. The sun was shining now, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope as I got back into my car. Maybe I could put the horrors of the night behind me and move on. As I drove away from the diner, I allowed myself to breathe easier. The road ahead was clear, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. But just as I turned onto the highway, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a flash of movement. I glanced back, and my heart dropped. Standing at the edge of the diner parking lot was the woman from room 11, her expression vacant, her hair wild and tangled. She lifted her hand and pointed directly at me, a silent accusation, a plea for help. I slammed on the brakes, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but in that moment a wave of dread washed over me, freezing me in place. I couldn't go back, not after everything I had experienced. I turned forward, fighting the urge to look again, but the image burned in my mind, the lost look in her eyes, the unspoken horror. I drove faster, desperate to escape the memory of that night, that place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had followed me, maybe it was all in my head, but deep down I felt an unsettling truth. The shadows of the Sundown Motel would always linger, and I could never truly escape the whispers that haunted the night. I had been driving for hours, fatigue settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. When I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance, Crescent Moon Motel, I pulled in, eager for a break. The motel was small, surrounded by dense trees, and had a nostalgic charm that drew me in. Inside, a woman with a tight bun greeted me from behind the counter. "Welcome, need a room?" "Yes, please," I replied, handing her cash. She slid me a key labeled 7 and directed me down the hall. Room 7 was simple, a bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the darkening woods. I tossed my bag onto the bed and approached the window, catching a glimpse of something white flitting between the trees. Probably just my imagination, I thought. After a quick shower, I settled onto the bed, flipping on the TV. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping against the wall. I paused the TV, straining to listen. The sound was rhythmic, almost like fingernails scratching wood. "Hello?" I called, unsure if it was coming from the neighboring room. No response. I hesitated, but curiosity urged me to investigate. I knocked on the door of room, my voice echoing in the silence. "Is everything okay in there?" Still nothing. I turned the knob, surprised to find it unlocked. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. On the floor I noticed a small doll, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes eerily vacant. Suddenly, a giggle echoed from the back of the room, sending a jolt of fear through me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. Silence. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I turned to exit, I heard the giggle again, closer this time, accompanied by small footsteps. "Leave me alone," I yelled, my heart racing as I stumbled out of the room. I slammed the door behind me, breathing heavily. The atmosphere felt oppressive, the hallway dim and foreboding. Back in my room, I locked the door, hoping to shut out whatever lurked in the shadows, but the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to ignore it, but the sound clawed at my nerves. Then, just as I thought it couldn't get worse, the TV flickered off, plunging the room into darkness. The tapping stopped, replaced by a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. "What do you want?" I croaked, the air growing thick with dread. "Leave. Now." The lights flickered back on, and there, standing before me, was a girl, no older than 10, her disheveled hair framing a pale face. "Why did you break my doll?" she asked, her tone eerily calm. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away. "I was just checking on you." She stepped closer, her eyes filled with a sorrow that twisted my gut. "You're not supposed to be here. They don't want you here." "Who? What do you mean?" he asked, desperate for answers. She pointed toward the window. "The shadows. They're angry." I turned, and my blood ran cold. Outside, dark figures writhed beneath the trees, their shapes flickering like candle flames. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "You need to leave before they take you," she urged, stepping back. "Please, just tell me how," I begged, fear coiling tighter in my chest. "The room with no exit," she whispered, then vanished into thin air. I stood there, reeling from the encounter. The shadows outside loomed larger, and I knew I had to find this room with no exit. I sprinted into the hallway, desperation fueling my every step. I passed room 6 and hesitated, remembering the girl's warning, but the whispers behind me pushed me forward. Turning left, then right, I felt lost in a maze. The motel felt alive, the walls closing in, shadows twisting and shifting. Finally, I found another door, room 8. I opened it hesitantly. Inside, the room was chaotic, the walls covered in strange symbols and scribbles. In the center stood a large, cracked mirror. I approached it, the whispers growing louder. "Find the exit," a voice echoed, layered and haunting. "What exit?" I shouted, but the whispers only intensified. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, sending shards flying. I stumbled back, terror rising as the door slammed shut behind me. Screams filled the air, shadows coalescing into dark figures, their faces twisted in rage. I pounded on the door, panic clawing at my throat. "Let me out." I screamed, my fists bruising against the wood. The shadows pressed closer, their voices merging into a cacophony of anger. "You shouldn't have come here." With a surge of adrenaline, I turned back to the mirror, its shards glinting menacingly. In the reflection, I saw the girl again, her expression filled with sorrow. "Find the door," she whispered before fading away. I grabbed a shard of glass, knowing I had to fight. As the shadows lunged, I plunged the shard into the mirror's frame. The glass shattered further, and the whispers became a howl of despair. "Get out," I yelled, and with one final strike, the mirror exploded into a shower of glass and light. I stumbled back, the shadows dissolving in the brilliance. The motel shuddered around me, and I ran, bursting through the door. Outside, the air was cool and fresh, the sun rising over the horizon. I turned back to see the motel, its dark presence fading into the morning light. I was free. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows would always linger. waiting for the next unwitting traveler to arrive at the Crescent Moon Motel.